Look, I know what you're thinking. Ancient Rome, right? Gladiators, emperors, massive armies conquering half the known world. Epic stuff. But here's the thing nobody tells you. For 99% of people living in ancient Rome, life wasn't epic at all. It was brutal, short, and filled with jobs that would absolutely wreck your body, your mind, or both. So tonight, we're doing something different. We're talking about the extremely rare, incredibly specific jobs in ancient Rome that wouldn't completely destroy you. Jobs where you might actually survive long enough to enjoy retirement, assuming you even made it that far. Before we dive in, do me a favor. If you genuinely enjoy this kind of content, hit that subscribe button. Only if you actually want to, though. I'm not going to beg. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see who's tuning in from around the world. Now let's get into it. If you imagine ancient Roman orgies as these wild, chaotic free-for-alls where people just showed up and hoped for the best, congratulations. You've been completely misled by Hollywood, Renaissance paintings, and people who desperately want Rome to seem more scandalous than it actually was. The reality? Romans were absolutely obsessed with structure. Even their debauchery came with schedules, guest lists, and contingency plans. That's where the orgy planner came in. This wasn't some participant having a good time. This was an administrator, a logistics expert, someone whose entire job revolved around making sure the wealthiest, most powerful people in the city could indulge themselves without accidentally destroying their political careers in the process. Because here's the thing. Nothing ended a senatorial career faster than being recognized at the wrong party by the wrong person. These events weren't public. They were invitation-only affairs where discretion was everything. The orgy planner managed guest lists with the precision of a military operation. Who could attend, who absolutely couldn't be in the same room when people arrived, when they needed to leave. Entertainment schedules, lighting, music, food service, the timing of everything. You weren't managing pleasure. You were managing reputations, which in Rome were infinitely more fragile than human life itself. Think about it like this. You're essentially a wedding planner, except your clients are senators, military generals, and people who could legally have you disappeared if something went wrong. The pressure was intense, but the rewards matched it. You needed discretion, obviously. Social intelligence was critical. And you had to master the art of leaving a room at precisely the right moment. Stay too long, and you become a liability, someone who's seen too much. Leave too early, and if something goes wrong, suddenly everyone's blaming you. Timing was absolutely everything. Here's what made this job brilliant from a survival perspective. You stayed indoors. You were clean, well-dressed, presentable. You weren't hauling stone blocks in the summer heat. You weren't rowing ships until your hands bled. You weren't on some winter military campaign wondering which of your limbs would get frostbite first. Your hands weren't calloused from manual labor. Your back wasn't broken from construction work. Your risk of being trampled by a horse or gored by some exotic animal was refreshingly low. Payment came in multiple forms, which was the Roman equivalent of diversifying your income. Money, obviously, but also gifts, favors from powerful people, protection when you needed it, and most importantly, future work. Impress one wealthy household, and suddenly you're being recommended quietly, discreetly, with a nod and a whisper. That's Roman networking. That's how you built a career that could actually sustain you. One successful event led to another, and before you knew it, you had a client list that kept you employed for years. Was it morally questionable? Absolutely. By any modern standard, yes. But was it physically exhausting? Not even slightly. Socially dangerous? Only if you talked too much, which any competent professional knew better than to do. And that's the real secret to survival in this role. You knew everything. You saw everything. You heard everything. And you said absolutely nothing. In a city where information was currency and gossip could get you killed, silence was your most valuable asset. In ancient Rome, the smartest job wasn't the bravest or the strongest. It was the one where everyone trusted you, nobody really noticed you, and absolutely no one wanted you dead. That alone puts the orgy planner near the top of the career ladder. You provided an essential service to the elite, you stayed safe while doing it, and you got paid well enough to live comfortably. In a civilization where most jobs involve some combination of backbreaking labor, disease, and early death, that was practically paradise. Ancient Rome had many luxury items that signaled wealth and status. Fine wine imported from distant provinces. Exotic animals that cost fortunes to acquire and maintain. Marble statues carved by master craftsmen. And in a choice that says absolutely everything about Roman priorities and values, human beings with dwarfism. If you were wealthy enough, owning a dwarf was considered fashionable, sophisticated even. It was a living symbol that you had both money and, let's be honest, questionable taste by any modern ethical standard. Now, let me be very clear about something important. The dwarf seller was not the person being sold. That distinction matters enormously. The dwarf seller was a dealer, a broker, an intermediary who understood elite demand and knew exactly how to supply it without ever lifting a stone block or marching onto a battlefield. In Rome, proximity to power mattered far more than moral clarity, and this job offered plenty of the former without requiring any of the latter. Wealthy Romans purchased dwarfs for various purposes. Some wanted entertainers for their parties. Others wanted companions or household curiosities. Some just wanted living symbols of their excess, proof that they could afford things other people couldn't even imagine owning. The seller's job was to arrange acquisitions, handle transport and logistics, negotiate prices, and manage the entire transaction from start to finish. You weren't involved in daily care. You weren't present for performances or entertainment. You handled the business side, the paperwork, the introductions, all while smiling politely and pretending this was completely normal. Because in Rome, it was normal. Nobody questioned it. The key advantage of this profession was that it operated entirely indoors and entirely among the elite. You met senators, wealthy merchants, powerful households who wanted exclusive items and generally didn't ask too many uncomfortable questions about where they came from or how they were acquired. You didn't sweat in the summer sun. You didn't bleed from injuries. You didn't freeze during winter. And you certainly weren't sent to fight anyone in military campaigns. Your work environment was comfortable, climate-controlled, and safe. The compensation reflected the moral discomfort of the role. Rare goods commanded high prices, and your commission on each sale was generous. A single successful transaction could fund months of comfortable living. And successful sellers built reputations that traveled quietly through aristocratic circles. Word of mouth among the wealthy was everything. Rome loved novelty, and novelty always paid well. If you could consistently deliver unusual items that impressed your clients, you became indispensable to them. Was this job morally disturbing by modern standards? Without question. There's no way around that. But Rome didn't run on modern ethical frameworks. It ran on status, spectacle, social dominance, and the accumulation of things that demonstrated your wealth and power. The dwarf seller survived and prospered by understanding that reality perfectly and navigating it without becoming the product themselves. That was the crucial distinction. You facilitated transactions for others while remaining free yourself. There was risk, of course. Say the wrong thing to the wrong patron, insult someone powerful, or badly mishandle an important transaction, and your career ended abruptly. Sometimes violently. But that was true of nearly every job in Rome that involved dealing with the elite. The difference was that most other jobs also involved significant physical danger and pain. Compared to working in stone quarries, serving in the military, or maintaining the city's sewage systems, this job required no muscle, no physical endurance, and very little actual danger to your person. Just negotiation skills, absolute discretion, and the ability to treat deeply strange demands as routine business matters. In ancient Rome, the best jobs weren't the most ethical. They were the most strategic. And the dwarf seller, unsettling as the role was, understood the market perfectly and stayed comfortably alive because of that understanding. In a world where most people died young from disease, malnutrition, accidents, or violence, simply staying alive and comfortable was the ultimate achievement. At some point in ancient Rome's long history, someone looked at a public urinal and thought to themselves, this could be taxed. That person was not joking around. They were dead serious. And thanks to that moment of bureaucratic inspiration, an entire profession was born. Yes, Rome actually taxed urine. This sounds absurd to modern ears, but stay with me, because it actually makes perfect sense once you understand the economics. Urine was valuable. Not symbolically valuable. Practically, economically valuable. It was rich in ammonia, which made it absolutely perfect for tanning leather and cleaning clothes. Fooleries, which were essentially ancient laundromats, relied on it completely. Tanners depended on it for their entire industry. And the Roman Empire, never one to miss a revenue opportunity, decided it deserved a cut. So they created a tax system around urine collection and made it official government policy. Enter the urine tax collector. Now, this job did not involve personal participation in the actual collection process, which is an important clarification I need to make right away. You weren't standing around public urinals with jars, hoping for a productive afternoon. You were an official representative of the state. You oversaw public collection points, recorded usage, ensured businesses paid their required fees for accessing this resource. In other words, you worked with ledgers and official documents, not with buckets of bodily waste. That's a crucial distinction. The beauty of this job was the authority it carried. You represented the state, the empire itself. That meant legal backing, official protection, and a level of respect that most Romans never experienced in their entire lives. When you showed up to collect taxes or inspect a facility, people listened to you. Not because they particularly liked you or enjoyed paying taxes, but because ignoring you carried serious consequences. You had the power of Roman law behind you, and everyone knew it. Was the work environment glamorous? Absolutely not. Let's not pretend otherwise. But it was urban, predictable, and mostly indoors, or at least indoors adjacent. You weren't breaking rocks in quarries under the blazing sun. You weren't freezing in some remote border garrison, wondering if today was the day a barbarian spear found you. You had a routine, regular hours, steady income, and most importantly, job security that most Romans could only dream about. And here's the most Roman part of this entire situation. Nobody laughed at you for being a urine tax collector. They might have complained bitterly about the tax itself. They might have grumbled and cursed the system. They might have insulted the very concept of taxing bodily waste. But they didn't mock the job or the person doing it, because Rome understood something very clearly. Anything that funded the empire was serious business. If urine collection kept the economy running and generated tax revenue, then the person managing and taxing it was doing important governmental work. There was also a certain ironic prestige attached to the position. You could casually mention your profession at dinner parties and watch people become visibly uncomfortable. Not impressed exactly, but uncomfortable, which in Roman social dynamics was actually a subtle form of power. You occupied a strange space in the social hierarchy. Essential but slightly absurd, respected but not admired, powerful but not glamorous. Of course, discretion mattered enormously in this role. You didn't dwell on the specific details of your work. You didn't overshare about what exactly you dealt with on a daily basis. You kept your explanations short, official, bureaucratic. The less elaboration, the better for everyone involved. You learned to read social situations and know when to talk about your work and when to simply describe yourself as a tax official and leave it at that. Compared to most Roman employment options, this job was remarkably stable, completely nonviolent, and oddly secure. The empire would always need tax revenue. People would always produce urine. That was biologically inevitable. Industries would always need it for their work. And Romans would always complain about taxes no matter what was being taxed. That combination meant your job wasn't going anywhere. Economic downturns might affect luxury goods sellers, but they didn't affect the urine tax collector. Your revenue stream was as reliable as human biology itself. In ancient Rome, this was not a joke position despite how it sounds to modern ears. It was proof of a fundamental Roman principle. If something existed, Rome would find a way to monetize it, regulate it, and extract tax revenue from it. And if you were the person facilitating that extraction, you had a stable government job with benefits, protection, and longevity. In a city where most people's careers ended with injury, disease, or death, that was actually an incredible achievement. Ancient Rome cared deeply about appearances. Not about morality, not about equality or fairness, but about appearances, about how things looked to other people. And one of the most important appearances a respectable, wealthy Roman could maintain was the illusion of effortlessness. This included having absolutely no visible body hair in places that society had decided were unacceptable. Which brings us to one of the strangest yet surprisingly stable professions in the ancient world. The armpit hair plucker. This was not a joke job. This was professional grooming, and grooming in Rome was culture, was civilization itself. Wealthy Romans genuinely believed that excess body hair signaled laziness, barbarism, a lack of refinement. Or worst of all in their minds, it suggested you might actually enjoy or be accustomed to physical labor. So they paid specialists to remove their body hair for them, slowly, carefully, thoroughly, one hair at a time. The process was exactly as tedious as it sounds, but for the person doing it, it was actually a remarkably good career. As an armpit hair plucker, your work took place entirely indoors, usually in private homes, bathhouses, or the personal chambers of wealthy clients. You had regular clients who needed your services repeatedly. Repeat business was built into the nature of hair growth. You had predictable hours, steady income, and while the job absolutely required patience and a strong tolerance for prolonged awkward silence, it did not involve heavy lifting, open wounds, military service, or any of the things that destroyed most Roman workers' bodies. That already placed it well above average on the Roman career ladder. The tools you needed were remarkably simple. tweezers, sometimes resin for larger areas, and most importantly, the confidence to inflict controlled discomfort while pretending nothing unusual was happening at all. You were expected to work carefully and efficiently, maintaining professional demeanor throughout. Any visible reaction from you, surprise, judgment, amusement, discomfort, would have been deeply unprofessional and potentially career-ending. The goal was to make the entire process feel routine and unremarkable, even when it absolutely was not routine by any reasonable standard. Pain was definitely part of the transaction. Plucking hair hurts. There's no way around that biological reality. But crucially, that pain belonged entirely to the client, not to you. You inflicted it professionally and got paid well for your expertise. Clients paid good money to feel refined and civilized afterward. Smooth skin was a serious status symbol in Roman culture. It communicated a very specific message. I do not perform manual labor. I do not sweat for my survival. I have people who handle these things for me. And you could be one of those people who got paid to maintain that illusion. Socially, this job placed you in a strange but surprisingly advantageous position. You were physically close to the elite, working in their most private spaces, yet you remained beneath their notice in terms of social threat. You heard conversations without being part of them. You learned secrets, personal information, political gossip, without being trusted enough to repeat them. You were essentially invisible, and invisibility in Rome was often the same thing as safety. People who stood out got noticed. People who got noticed faced danger. You wanted to be useful and forgettable. Was it glamorous work? Absolutely not. Was it dignified in any conventional sense? That's highly debatable depending on your perspective. But was it dramatically safer than farming, quarry work, construction, or rowing ships? Without question. Most Roman jobs destroyed your body within a few years. This one required steady hands, emotional detachment, extreme patience, and the ability to pretend this was all perfectly normal and acceptable. Which in Roman culture, it genuinely was normal. Nobody questioned it. If you wanted a job that kept you indoors, kept you fed and housed, kept you alive into old age, and you didn't mind spending several hours a day in very close proximity to someone else's armpit, this was actually a surprisingly solid career choice. You learned a valuable skill that wealthy people needed. You built a client base that provided steady income, and you avoided all the things that killed most Romans before they reached 40. In the grand scheme of Roman employment, that was practically winning the lottery. Ancient Romans absolutely loved a good funeral. Not because they particularly enjoyed death, although they were strangely comfortable with mortality in ways modern people often aren't, but because funerals were public performances. They were status displays, elaborate demonstrations that the deceased had mattered, that their family was important, and most crucially, that they could afford to prove all of this with an expensive, memorable ceremony. And nothing communicated importance quite like hiring complete strangers to cry dramatically on your family's behalf. Enter the professional mourner. This job required absolutely no physical strength, no literacy or education, no military training, and no long-term emotional commitment whatsoever. All it required was volume, good timing, and the ability to look convincingly devastated about someone you had met approximately 5 minutes before they died, or sometimes never met at all. Professional mourners were hired to attend funerals, public processions, and memorial ceremonies, where they wailed, sobbed loudly, tore at their clothing, and generally made an impressive scene. The louder and more theatrical the grief, the more successful the funeral appeared. Roman families genuinely believed that visible, audible sorrow honored the dead, even when that sorrow was purchased by the hour like any other service. From a career perspective, this setup was absolutely excellent news. The work was temporary and project-based. Each funeral lasted a few hours or maybe a day. The pay was decent for the time invested. And once the funeral procession ended and the body was buried or cremated, your responsibilities ended completely. You didn't have to remain sad. You didn't have to remember the deceased person's name or anything about them. You simply collected your payment and moved on to the next performance, the next funeral, the next family willing to pay for professional grief. It was emotional labor, certainly, but only on a very controlled schedule. You performed grief from this time to that time, and then you went home and lived your normal life. There was no expectation that you'd carry that sorrow with you or maintain the performance outside of working hours. That boundary between work and personal life was actually quite clear and professionally respected. The job was remarkably physically safe compared to most Roman employment. You weren't carrying heavy loads that would destroy your back. You weren't inhaling toxic fumes from metalworking or tanning. You weren't standing in front of angry animals in the arena. Your work consisted of walking slowly in processions, crying on cue, gesturing dramatically, and occasionally collapsing with theatrical flair when the moment called for it. Compared to quarry labor or military service, this was absolute luxury. You were performing, not laboring. There was also a strange social benefit that professional mourners enjoyed. You were not only expected but actively encouraged to be extremely expressive. You could openly scream about injustice, fate, the cruelty of life, the unfairness of death. These were things most Romans felt deeply, but rarely voiced in their daily lives. In the controlled setting of a funeral, grief became socially acceptable chaos. Your emotional display was not only permitted, but required and compensated. And here's the beautiful part. No one took your words personally. Nobody analyzed what you said for hidden meanings or subtext. If you cried out about betrayal, about loss, about suffering and pain, everyone understood it was symbolic, part of the performance. You were voicing emotions on behalf of everyone present, giving collective feeling a voice and a face. That's actually a form of emotional service that many cultures throughout history have valued and compensated. You were doing important cultural work, helping communities process grief and loss through ritualized performance. Of course, reputation mattered in this profession like any other. A good professional mourner knew how to pace their grief appropriately. Too quiet, too subdued, and you looked cheap, like the family hadn't paid enough for quality mourning. Too dramatic, too over the top, and you risked becoming distracting, pulling focus from the deceased onto yourself. That balance was absolutely key. You needed to enhance the ceremony without overwhelming it. Timing was everything, knowing when to build emotion, when to peak, when to allow quiet moments. Was it dignified work by aristocratic standards? Not really. The elite looked down on it. But was it stable employment? Reasonably so. People kept dying, funerals kept happening, and families kept wanting impressive ceremonies. Was it safer than the vast majority of Roman jobs? Undeniably yes. In ancient Rome, grief was a service industry. And if you could cry convincingly on command, adjust your emotional intensity to match the situation, and show up reliably when hired, Rome was absolutely willing to pay you for that theatrical skill. You were providing something families genuinely wanted and needed, and you were doing it without destroying your body in the process. That made it a legitimately good job by Roman standards. If there was one single place in all of ancient Rome where life felt almost civilized, almost comfortable by modern standards, it was the bathhouse. You had warm rooms heated by sophisticated hypocaust systems. You had flowing water, both hot and cold. You had food vendors nearby selling snacks and drinks. You had gossip flowing as freely as the water itself. It was less about public hygiene in the modern sense, and more like a social headquarters that happened to include bathing. A community center with steam. And if you actually worked there as a bathhouse attendant, congratulations. You had secured one of the most stable, tolerable, and genuinely decent jobs in the entire Roman Empire. Bathhouse attendants were absolutely everywhere in these facilities. They managed towels and oils for the bathers. They monitored water temperature in the different pools. They handled seating arrangements and maintained order. And occasionally, they performed the delicate diplomatic task of telling powerful, important men that yes, it actually was time for them to leave the pool and let other people use it. This required significant confidence, excellent tact, and the ability to sound apologetic while being absolutely firm in your position. Rome valued that combination of deference and authority very highly. The best part of this job from a survival perspective was simple. You worked indoors. Always. You were always warm, surrounded by heated rooms and hot water. You were always near food vendors and their offerings. You were always near people who had money to spend on leisure activities. In a city where winter cold, infectious disease, and physical exhaustion were constant threats to survival, working in a heated building with regular, predictable hours was genuinely a gift from the gods. This wasn't hyperbole. It was a massive quality of life advantage. Yes, you saw a lot of naked bodies. An enormous number of naked bodies daily. But after the first week of work, this stopped registering as strange or noteworthy. Roman modesty was incredibly flexible at best, and bathhouses were judgment-free zones long before that phrase was ever invented. Your job was not to react to nudity or be surprised by anything. Your job was to assist people, nod politely, provide good service, and pretend that everything happening around you is completely normal and unremarkable. Which in Rome, it genuinely was normal. Bathhouses were communal spaces where social barriers relaxed significantly. The social advantage of this job absolutely cannot be overstated. Bathhouses were where business deals were negotiated and finalized. They were where political rumors spread faster than anywhere else in the city. They were where important people let their guards down, and their real opinions slipped out between the steam and the wine. As an attendant, you heard absolutely everything while being noticed by essentially no one. You weren't important enough or threatening enough to make anyone guard their words around you. And that made you effectively invisible, which in ancient Rome was actually a highly effective form of protection and safety. People who seemed important or dangerous often got targeted. People who knew too much sometimes got silenced. But the bathhouse attendant? Nobody worried about the attendant. You were part of the furniture, part of the facility itself. That social invisibility meant you could accumulate information, understand the political landscape, know who was allied with whom, all without ever being seen as a threat to anyone's interests. Payment for this work was steady and reliable. The bathhouse operated every day, year-round. Tips from satisfied customers were common and often generous, especially if you provided excellent service or remembered people's preferences. And regular patrons, people who came to the same bathhouse frequently, often developed favorite attendants they trusted and tipped well. This ensured repeat income and a form of informal protection. No one wanted to anger or upset the person who handled their massage oils or knew where their valuable belongings were stored while they bathed. Was the job glamorous? No, absolutely not. Was it occasionally unpleasant? Yes, certainly. You dealt with difficult customers, complaints, the inevitable chaos of managing public spaces. But was it infinitely better than farming until your body gave out, working in stone quarries until you couldn't breathe properly, or marching toward battlefields where you had a decent chance of not returning home? Without question. Without any doubt whatsoever. Most Roman jobs destroyed the body within a few years through repetitive strain, injury, or exposure. This one required social awareness, patience, interpersonal skills, and the intelligence to navigate complex social situations. And unlike many Roman professions, it didn't end with you being buried far from home in an unmarked grave with no one left alive who remembered your name. In ancient Rome, warmth was power. Comfort was power. Stability was power. and bathhouse attendants lived and worked right at the center of all three. That made it genuinely one of the best jobs available to ordinary Romans, who weren't born into wealth or privilege. Gambling in ancient Rome was officially frowned upon by the authorities, technically restricted by various laws, and enthusiastically practiced anyway by almost everyone who had spare coins and poor impulse control, which was a lot of people. Dice games popped up constantly in taverns, back rooms, private homes, street corners, and basically anywhere two Romans could stand close enough to argue loudly. And in any situation where money and heated tempers came together, someone sensible and neutral needed to stand in the middle and maintain order. That someone was the dice game referee. This profession existed for one very practical reason. Romans were passionate, obsessive gamblers, and they were even more passionate sore losers. Accusations of cheating were incredibly common. Voices rose quickly over disputed throws, and knives had an alarming tendency to appear during disagreements about whose role clearly counted and whose didn't. A neutral, trusted referee prevented games from escalating into crime scenes or full-blown violence. You were the stabilizing presence that kept entertainment from becoming bloodshed. As a referee, your job was explicitly not to gamble yourself. That was absolutely crucial to maintaining your neutral position and authority. You observed the dice throws carefully. You enforced the agreed-upon rules consistently. You verified payouts to make sure everyone got what they'd won or paid what they'd lost. And you shut the entire game down immediately when tensions escalated beyond a manageable point. You were essentially the adult in the room, the voice of reason, which in Rome automatically made you valuable and worth paying for. The best part about this position was the clientele you dealt with. Dice games attracted people with money to lose. Merchants taking a break from business. Retired soldiers with their pensions. Minor government officials. Wealthy freedmen looking for entertainment. All of them were eager to test their luck after a few drinks, and all of them paid referees well. Why? Because losing money was painful, obviously, but losing money unfairly because someone cheated was absolutely unacceptable. Your presence and your neutral judgment reassured everyone that the outcomes were legitimate, that the game was honest. Even when it absolutely wasn't always honest, your authority made it feel fair. This job required supreme confidence and presence. You needed a calm voice that commanded respect. And you needed the ability to stare down a man who genuinely believed that fate, the gods, and fortune itself personally hated him and had conspired against him. You didn't argue with these people. You didn't debate. You stated your rulings clearly, firmly, and then moved on immediately. Lingering meant trouble. Second-guessing yourself meant losing authority. Your decisions had to be quick and absolutely final, with no room for negotiation or appeal. Physically, the work was remarkably easy. You stood and watched the games. You occasionally intervened when necessary. You collected your payment. That was it. No heavy labor. No long marches carrying equipment. No rowing boats until your hands bled. No freezing in winter guard duty. The biggest physical risk came from choosing the wrong venue to work in or failing to exit at precisely the right moment when things turned violent. But these were skills any experienced referee learned quickly through practice and observation. Socially, it was an excellent position with interesting dynamics. You were trusted by everyone present because you had no stake in the outcome. Everyone wanted you there to ensure fairness. But importantly, no one blamed you when they lost their money. That was fate, bad luck, the gods' will. Unless they were seriously drunk, in which case you left immediately before they could redirect their anger toward you. Discretion and good timing kept you alive and employed. Was it glamorous work? No. Was it perfectly safe? Not entirely. There were risks. But was it significantly smarter than most Roman employment options? Absolutely yes. In a society where fortune was both worshipped and blamed in equal measure, where people simultaneously believed in fate and tried desperately to control it, the person who enforced the rules of chance held quiet but real power. You didn't beat the odds yourself. You didn't need to. You made sure the odds were followed properly, and in ancient Rome, that was actually a very respectable, sustainable way to stay alive and earn a living. People kept gambling, you kept refereeing, and the money kept coming. Simple, reliable, and far better than breaking rocks in a quarry. Ancient Rome was built on three foundations. Concrete that lasted millennia. Military conquest that expanded the empire. And an absolutely unshakable belief that invisible supernatural forces were deeply, personally invested in everyone's individual business. Gods, ancestral spirits, omens read in bird flight, prophetic dreams. Rome trusted all of them, especially when life felt unpredictable and dangerous, which was essentially always. And that cultural reality made fortune sellers incredibly useful and surprisingly well compensated. Let me be very clear about something important. A fortune seller was not a genuine prophet. This job had absolutely nothing to do with real divine insight or supernatural powers, and everything to do with carefully worded reassurance and strategic vagueness. You didn't actually predict the future. That was impossible. You suggested favorable possibilities. You offered vague interpretations. You provided readings that could not be proven wrong without access to a time machine. Your tools were remarkably simple. Symbolic objects like bones, stones, or cards. Dramatic pauses that built tension. And sentences that sounded deeply meaningful while committing to absolutely nothing specific. Classic fortune seller phrases worked on everyone. A significant change approaches you soon. Beware the envy of those close to you. Fortune favors the patient in this matter. These statements were brilliant because they were universally applicable and completely unfalsifiable. They worked on everyone from anxious merchants worried about shipments to senators, who absolutely should have known better, but were just as superstitious as everyone else. The brilliance of this job, the real genius of it, was the built-in safety. You were never responsible for actual outcomes. If something good happened to your client afterward, you were clearly gifted with genuine prophetic powers. If something bad happened, the client had obviously misunderstood your advice, ignored what you told them, or angered the gods in some unrelated way that you couldn't have predicted. Either way, you were never at fault. Rome's cultural logic fully supported this reasoning. People accepted it completely. You worked indoors, or in busy public spaces like forums and marketplaces. You didn't lift anything heavy. You didn't fight anyone. You didn't travel far unless you wanted to, and were paid well for the journey. Clients came to you, seeking you out, desperate for certainty in a world where disease could kill overnight, debt could destroy families instantly, and political winds changed without warning. Payment varied considerably depending on the client and situation, but repeat customers were extremely common. People absolutely loved hearing things that confirmed what they already believed, especially when it sounded official and mystical. And because Romans were deeply, profoundly superstitious as a culture, no one mocked the fortune-telling profession openly. Even skeptics, even people who privately doubted, avoided public criticism just in case the fortune seller was actually right and the gods were listening. That cultural protection was enormously valuable. You had social legitimacy that other questionable professions didn't enjoy. Socially, this job placed you in an absolutely fascinating position. People told you their deepest fears. They revealed their secret hopes. They shared information they wouldn't tell their own families. And you listened, nodded thoughtfully, maintained a mysterious expression, and never reacted with surprise or judgment. Reacting would have been deeply unprofessional, and would have broken the mystical atmosphere. Your power came from listening carefully and speaking just enough, but never too much. The only real danger in this profession was being too specific in your predictions. If you predicted an exact date, a specific name, or a particular event, you invited serious trouble when it didn't happen as described. Skilled fortune sellers avoided concrete details like they avoided the plague, which coincidentally was also something people frequently asked about and paid for predictions regarding. Was it honest work? Absolutely not. It was fundamentally deceptive. But was it lucrative? Very much yes. Was it safer than farming, military service, or stone cutting? Without any question. In ancient Rome, certainty was rare and valuable. Confidence was priceless. Control over anxiety was worth paying for. And if you could sell calm reassurance wrapped in mystical mystery and religious terminology, Rome would gladly, eagerly pay you for it. You were providing a genuine psychological service that people desperately wanted, even if the supernatural framework was entirely constructed. and you were doing it without destroying your body or risking your life. That made it an excellent job by any practical standard. Ancient Rome absolutely loved words, written language, public communication. Laws were carved into stone monuments for everyone to see. Poems were scratched onto walls throughout the city. Insults were immortalized in public places where no one could pretend they hadn't seen them. And long before internet comment sections and anonymous social media accounts, Rome had graffiti. Massive amounts of graffiti everywhere. Political slogans, declarations of love, crude insults, business advertisements, public shamings, all of it scrawled on walls across the city. But here's the critical thing. Not everyone could actually write. Literacy was definitely useful, socially respected, and valuable. But it was also surprisingly rare among the general population. So if you could write clearly, quickly, and without panicking under pressure, people were absolutely willing to pay you good money to put their words on walls where they themselves didn't want to be seen doing it. Enter the graffiti writer for hire. A professional who got paid to express other people's thoughts anonymously. This job involved painting or carefully scratching messages onto walls, columns, and buildings throughout the city. Political slogans supporting or attacking particular candidates. Love notes declaring passion for someone. Insults aimed at enemies. Threats meant to intimidate. Commercial advertisements for businesses. Public shaming of people who'd wronged someone. All of these messages needed a discreet, skilled hand to execute them. You weren't expressing your own opinions or feelings. You were ghostwriting outrage, passion, and politics for paying clients. The genius of this job was the double anonymity it provided. Your client stayed completely invisible. No one knew who had paid for the message. And you stayed invisible too. Ideally, at least. A truly good graffiti writer worked during odd hours when streets were empty. They chose locations carefully for maximum visibility and impact. And they left absolutely no trace beyond the message itself. Speed was crucial. Legibility mattered enormously. And spelling was absolutely critical. Nothing undermined a serious political insult faster than an obvious spelling mistake that made the writer look stupid. Physically, the work was quite manageable. You walked through the city at night. You climbed a little to reach good wall space. You wrote or painted your message. And then you left quickly and quietly. No heavy lifting. No full days of exhausting labor. No one shouting orders at you constantly. Unless you were caught, which was strongly discouraged and which you worked hard to avoid. Most jobs were completed quickly, paid for in advance to minimize risk, and forgotten by morning when people discovered the new messages. Socially, this role was absolutely fascinating. You shaped public opinion and political discourse without ever attaching your name to it. People argued passionately about your words in the forum, while you watched quietly from the sidelines, fully aware that none of them knew you were responsible. Power without visibility. influence without attribution. That was an extremely rare luxury in Roman society. The risks were definitely real, though limited if you were careful. Graffiti was technically illegal in many contexts, especially political messages that attacked officials or powerful people. Getting caught could result in fines, physical punishment, or worse depending on who felt targeted by what you've written. Skilled writers minimized these risks by avoiding extremes. No direct, specific accusations against the most powerful individuals. No signatures ever. No lingering at the scene. Write and disappear. Your clients ranged widely. Young lovers wanting to declare their feelings publicly. Merchants advertising their businesses. Politicians running campaigns. Personal rivals settling grudges through painted words instead of violence. Everyone wanted their message seen, read, and discussed. But crucially, they didn't want it traced back to them personally. You provided exactly that service. Visibility without attribution. Was it respectable work? Not officially, no. The authorities frowned on it. But was it profitable? Often very much so. Was it safer than being a soldier or a manual laborer? Absolutely yes. In ancient Rome, words were genuine weapons that could destroy reputations and influence politics. And if you knew how to wield those weapons quietly and skillfully, you could make a decent living shaping the city's voice and public discourse, one wall at a time. You were essentially a combination of advertiser, political operative, and public relations specialist, all rolled into one anonymous role. And you did it all without anyone knowing who you were, which in Rome was often the key to staying alive and prosperous. On paper, being a food taster in ancient Rome sounds like an absolutely terrible idea. Actually, it sounds suicidal. You eat the food first, before anyone else. If the food happens to be poisoned, you find out immediately and dramatically. End of job. End of life. And yet somehow, mysteriously, this was actually considered a genuinely good position. Not because Romans were reckless or stupid, but because they were paranoid in a very specific, very organized, very Roman way that actually made this job much safer than it initially appears. Food tasters were employed by wealthy households, government officials, and powerful patrons who were deeply, constantly concerned that someone somewhere was actively plotting to assassinate them through their dinner. Poisoning was seen as the sophisticated, civilized way to eliminate political enemies, which meant the person who ate first, who tested the food, needed to be completely trusted, carefully protected, and kept very physically close to the person they were protecting. This wasn't a disposable position. It was a position of genuine trust and importance. Here's the key detail that most people miss when they think about this job. Actual poisonings were quite rare. Romans talked about poisoning constantly. They feared it obsessively. They accused each other of it regularly in political disputes. But successful poisonings were genuinely uncommon in reality. Most deaths came from infectious disease, accidents, or political violence conducted with conventional weapons, like knives and swords, not from elaborate poison plots carried out during meals. That statistical reality meant the food taster's actual job was less a daily gamble with death and more a form of symbolic reassurance and security theater. You took a few small bites of each dish. You waited briefly to see if you showed any immediate symptoms. You didn't. The household relaxed visibly. Dinner proceeded normally. Everyone congratulated themselves on surviving another evening and being properly cautious. Your presence made them feel safe, and that feeling was what they were really paying for. In return for providing this security and peace of mind, you ate exceptionally well. Better than almost anyone else in Rome except the elite themselves. You sampled the absolute best food in the household every single day. Fresh bread, quality meat, good wine, fresh fruit, delicacies imported from across the empire. None of the cheap barley porridge or questionable leftovers that most Romans survived on. Your diet was genuinely excellent. If you survived long enough to build real trust with your employer, which most food tasters did because, again, actual poisonings were rare, your position became permanent and secure. Permanent employment meant protection, stability, guaranteed food and shelter. Food tasters were rarely left alone or unguarded. They lived near their employers in the household. They traveled with them when they moved. And they were protected indirectly by the same security forces that guarded the patron himself. Why? Because killing the food taster wasn't particularly useful to an assassin unless they planned to immediately kill the main target right afterward anyway, which meant random poisoning attempts specifically targeting the taster were extremely unlikely. Socially, the role carried strange but genuine prestige. You weren't important in the political sense, but you were absolutely necessary. People noticed immediately if you weren't present at a meal. You had access to private rooms and conversations that other servants didn't. You heard sensitive political discussions while standing quietly nearby, pretending not to hear anything. And once again, silence was your most valuable professional skill. You heard everything, knew everything, and said absolutely nothing to anyone. The real risks in this job came from things other than poison. Overindulgence was actually dangerous. Eating too much rich food daily could make you sick. Alcohol was a genuine hazard if you weren't careful. Poor health from other causes could end your career. But importantly, these risks applied to absolutely everyone in Rome, not just food tasters. They weren't unique occupational hazards. They were just life. Was it technically dangerous? Yes, in theory. Was it well-fed, properly sheltered, and stable employment? Very much so. Was it dramatically better than working in stone quarries, serving in the legions, or maintaining the sewage systems? Without any question whatsoever. In ancient Rome, the person who ate first didn't just protect the powerful elite from poison plots. They protected themselves simultaneously with excellent food, steady shelter, social proximity to power, and the quiet comfort of being genuinely needed and valued. That combination made it actually one of the better jobs available to people without independent wealth or aristocratic family connections. When people hear the words animals and ancient Rome in the same sentence, their minds immediately lead to one place: the arena, the Colosseum. Blood, chaos, screaming crowds, and some unfortunate person or animal being dramatically mauled for public entertainment. Fortunately, that is absolutely not the job we're talking about here. This is the other animal profession in Rome. The safer one. The civilized version that doesn't end with applause and death. Wealthy Romans absolutely loved exotic animals. Lions from Africa. Leopards from distant provinces. Monkeys from strange lands. Unusual birds with brilliant plumage. Creatures that most Roman citizens had never seen outside of rumors and stories. Owning one of these animals was a serious status symbol. It was a way of publicly saying, I am so rich and powerful that I can import expensive problems from other continents just because I want to. And once these rare animals arrived in Rome after long, difficult journeys, someone had to actually take care of them on a daily basis. That someone was the exotic animal handler, the private version, not the arena version. Your job involved feeding these animals properly, cleaning their living spaces, training them to be manageable and to perform on command, transporting them when necessary, and showing them off impressively to guests and visitors. These creatures lived in private menageries, in wealthy villas, in elaborate gardens, in aristocratic estates, far from screaming crowds and sharp weapons. You worked under relatively controlled conditions, usually with animals that were at least somewhat accustomed to human presence and interaction. This was animal care and husbandry, not combat choreography or blood sport. The work required specialized knowledge and remarkable calm under pressure, not brute physical strength. You needed to understand animal behavior deeply. You needed to establish routines that kept the animals healthy. And most critically, you needed to know how not to startle or provoke something that had teeth, claws, or the ability to seriously hurt you. Handlers who survived their first year in the job learned these skills quickly through experience. Handlers who didn't survive, well, Rome had an enormous population and there were always replacements available. But competent handlers who proved themselves became genuinely valuable. The benefits of this position were quite significant. You worked for elite households, which meant automatic protection, access to decent food, and stable shelter. You weren't working outside in agricultural fields. You weren't marching with a military shield and heavy equipment. You weren't breathing toxic dust in stone quarries. You had a highly specialized skill that made you considerably harder to replace than common laborers. And replaceability was genuinely the real killer in Roman employment. Common workers were disposable. Specialists were valuable. There was also real prestige attached to this role. People listened to you when animals were involved because you were the acknowledged expert. If a wealthy patron wanted to show off their imported leopard to important guests, your presence and expertise mattered enormously. You were the reason the impressive display didn't accidentally turn into a very expensive disaster where the leopard ate someone important. Your knowledge prevented catastrophe and made your employer look sophisticated and in control. Yes, there was definitely risk involved. These were wild animals, not domesticated pets. They were unpredictable and potentially very dangerous. But compared to working in the arena where the entire point was orchestrated violence and death, the odds of survival were dramatically better. No crowds demanding blood and spectacle. No scheduled violence for entertainment. Just daily routine, mutual respect between you and the animals, and careful maintenance of safe distance and proper protocols. Was it completely safe? No, obviously not. Working with large predators is never entirely safe. Was it respectable work? Surprisingly, yes, actually. You were a skilled specialist providing an important service to the wealthy. Was it better than the vast majority of Roman jobs available to ordinary people? Easily, without question. In ancient Rome, survival often came down to one simple rule that everyone understood. Don't work in places where people or animals are expected to die for public entertainment. The exotic animal handler position, the quiet private version, passed that test beautifully and offered genuine career stability to people who developed the necessary skills and knowledge. Every great civilization throughout history gets judged by future generations based on three things: its monumental architecture, its legal and political systems, and eventually, perhaps inevitably, its toilets and sanitation infrastructure. Ancient Rome, to its enormous credit, took sanitation remarkably seriously for its time period. Public latrines were common throughout the city, constantly busy, and absolutely essential to urban life and public health. And because anything essential in Rome inevitably became regulated, taxed, and officially supervised, someone had to manage these facilities. That someone was the public toilet manager. This job sounds deeply unpleasant when you first hear about it. But here's the thing. It sounds much worse until you actually compare it honestly to literally anything else involving manual labor with a shovel, serving on battlefields, or working on the open sea. Suddenly it starts looking considerably better. As a public toilet manager, you oversaw access to the facilities. You managed cleanliness and maintenance. You enforced basic order and rules. You collected user fees when applicable. But critically, you weren't personally cleaning everything with your bare hands all day every day. That actual physical labor was delegated to lower-level workers. You supervised the operation. You managed the system. You ensured it kept functioning properly. And proper function genuinely mattered to the city. Roman public toilets were actually social spaces, not shameful hidden corners. People talked extensively while using them. They argued about politics. They conducted business negotiations. They shared the latest gossip and rumors. These facilities were communal, practical, surprisingly orderly, and integrated into daily urban life. Someone had to ensure that this social order remained intact and that the facilities continued operating smoothly. And that person was you, the manager. The greatest advantage of this job was remarkable stability. People never stopped using toilets. Ever. Not during wars. Not during plague outbreaks. Not during political chaos and civil unrest. None of those crises interrupted the basic biological human need to sit down and relieve yourself while contemplating your life choices. That meant absolutely steady employment, reliable income, and official municipal protection. You worked directly for the city government. And the city, in return, wanted you alive and functioning because you provided an essential service. Socially, this role came with an odd but genuine form of authority. You controlled access to something that absolutely everyone needed multiple times daily. That meant people listened when you spoke and followed your instructions. You weren't glamorous or prestigious. But you also weren't invisible or powerless. You had a specific, necessary place in the urban administrative system that simply could not be ignored or eliminated. Let's address the obvious issue directly. The smell. Yes, it existed. It was definitely there. But here's some important context. Rome already smelled intensely like smoke from countless fires, animals being butchered and kept in the city, human sweat from massive crowds, and raw ambition mixed with poverty. The public toilets honestly didn't stand out as much as you might think in that overall olfactory environment. And after a short adjustment period, your nose simply gave up and surrendered to the situation. You stopped noticing it consciously. Physically, the job was quite manageable. You worked indoors or in covered structures. There was no heavy lifting required of managers. There was no exposure to harsh weather conditions. There were no marching orders sending you to distant dangerous places. The most dangerous or difficult part of your entire day was occasionally having to tell an angry citizen that no, this was absolutely not the appropriate place to have a loud political argument. Please take it outside. That was about as bad as it got for you personally. Was it pleasant work? Not exactly, let's be honest. Was it reliable and secure? Absolutely yes. Was it dramatically safer than farming until your body broke down, working in stone quarries until you couldn't breathe, or marching toward battlefields with significant chances of not returning? By an enormous margin, yes. In ancient Rome, real power often came from controlling absolute necessities of daily life. And nothing was more necessary, more inevitable, or more universal than the public toilet. That gave you job security that most Romans could only dream about having. In ancient Rome, being able to read and write was not common at all. It wasn't expected of ordinary people. It wasn't universal or widespread. And that single demographic fact quietly transformed literacy into one of the most powerful survival tools available in the entire empire. If you could read competently and write clearly, Rome had steady work for you. Enter the professional letter writer, a crucial figure in Roman urban life. This job existed for one simple reason. A shocking number of Romans had things they desperately needed to communicate in writing but absolutely could not spell or compose themselves. Love letters expressing romantic feelings. Legal complaints that needed to sound official. Business deals requiring proper contracts. Apologies that needed the right tone. Threats that needed to sound serious. Petitions to government officials. All of it required written words, proper grammar, appropriate tone. And all of that required you, the professional writer. As a letter writer, your work was clean and entirely indoor. It was mentally demanding rather than physically destructive to your body. You sat comfortably. You listened carefully to what your clients wanted to express. And then you translated their emotional chaos, their rambling thoughts, their confused feelings into respectable, properly formatted Latin. You turned angry rants into persuasive legal arguments. You transformed romantic disasters into something vaguely poetic and touching. You made people sound more educated, more sophisticated, more articulate than they actually were. Your clients came from absolutely every level of Roman society. Merchants needed proper business contracts. Soldiers far from home needed letters to their families. Politicians needed carefully worded messages that said just enough to be useful, but absolutely no more than was safe. You were trusted with extremely private thoughts, personal grievances, and occasionally criminal plans that were definitely best not repeated aloud to anyone. That trust was the foundation of your entire business. The real advantage of this profession was the expectation of total discretion. You were expected to completely forget what you had written the moment the ink dried on the page. Asking follow-up questions was unprofessional and unwelcome. Offering your personal opinions was potentially dangerous to your health. Silence kept you employed and alive. You wrote what you were paid to write, you accepted your payment, and you forgot the entire transaction immediately. Payment was steady and reliable. Repeat clients were extremely common because people's need to communicate in writing was ongoing. Once people trusted you with their private matters, they returned again and again. And trust in Rome was far more valuable than raw talent or skill. A good letter writer became absolutely indispensable, especially to powerful people who could not afford to sound foolish, uneducated, or inarticulate in their written correspondence. Socially, this role placed you in a unique and advantageous position. You weren't important enough to threaten anyone politically, but you were valuable enough to be protected by your clients. People genuinely needed you to remain alive, sober enough to work, and quiet enough to keep their secrets. That combination of being useful, but not threatening, extended your life expectancy quite dramatically in a dangerous city. There were risks, certainly. Writing something that offended the wrong powerful person could end very badly for you. But careful, neutral wording, professional tone, and deliberate emotional detachment minimized that danger significantly. A truly skilled letter writer knew how to say much while actually promising very little. How to sound committed while remaining vague. That was a talent Rome admired deeply and rewarded consistently. Was it glamorous work? No. Was it quietly influential? Very much yes. Was it safer than most available Roman jobs? Absolutely. In a world ultimately ruled by force and violence, the ability to control and shape language was rare, genuine power. And if you could skillfully shape words for other people without ever attaching your own name to them, Rome rewarded you generously. Not with fame or public recognition, but with something far more valuable. Steady income and continued survival. You got paid well to stay anonymous and useful. In Rome, that was actually an ideal career outcome. Ancient Rome was deeply, profoundly religious, but not in the comforting, personal, spiritual way that people sometimes imagine when they think about ancient religion. Roman religion was fundamentally transactional. You offered the gods proper respect, appropriate sacrifices, and correct rituals. And in return, you desperately hoped they wouldn't actively ruin your life. Getting that exchange right mattered enormously. And not everyone knew how to do it properly. That gap in knowledge created a lucrative opportunity. The religious access facilitator. This was explicitly not a priest. Priests had official duties, strict rules, and serious public responsibilities. You, on the other hand, had something different and arguably more useful. You had connections. You knew which temples were genuinely influential. You knew which priests were flexible and could be negotiated with. You knew which specific rituals carried the most social weight and political importance. You understood proper timing for religious activities. You knew the complex protocols. And most importantly, you knew who needed an introduction to religious authorities and who absolutely did not. Your job was arranging access to the religious establishment. You scheduled important meetings with religious officials. You secured favorable slots for rituals and ceremonies. You advised wealthy clients on appropriate offerings to make. And you quietly smoothed over religious mistakes after they happened. Someone said the wrong prayer accidentally, offended the wrong deity through ignorance, missed an auspicious day for an important ceremony. That's exactly where you stepped in, calmly explaining that for a modest fee, everything could be corrected and the gods appeased properly. The brilliance of this role was that you had proximity to real power without personal responsibility for outcomes. Politicians, military generals, wealthy merchants, and ambitious families all desperately wanted divine favor. Or at minimum, they wanted the public appearance of divine favor. You helped them achieve that without ever claiming divine authority yourself. If things went well afterward, clearly the gods were pleased with your arrangements. If things went badly, well, fate was unpredictable, and the gods worked in mysterious ways. Either way, nothing was ever your fault. You were just the facilitator. Rome's cultural logic fully accepted this reasoning. Work conditions were genuinely excellent. You worked indoors in comfortable settings. You kept civilized hours. There was no physical labor involved. No travel unless you wanted it, and were paid well for it. You dressed respectably, spoke carefully and diplomatically, and cultivated an air of quiet importance and mysterious knowledge. People listened to you carefully because they genuinely believed you understood the invisible supernatural systems that govern their lives and fates. Payment came in multiple valuable forms. Direct fees for services, gifts from grateful clients, but most importantly, ongoing patronage and connections. A successful religious access facilitator didn't actually need many clients. You just needed the right clients. Influential ones. Wealthy ones. Powerful ones. Once you were properly embedded in elite social circles, you became extremely difficult to remove or replace. Everyone needed your services eventually, and no one wanted to offend you because you might be genuinely connected to divine powers. Better safe than sorry. The only real danger in this profession was overpromising results. If you claimed too much direct authority or implied you could personally control divine outcomes, actual priests would notice and object strenuously. If you failed to deliver on promises, clients would vanish and your reputation would collapse. Skilled facilitators stayed deliberately vague, endlessly reassuring, and impeccably polite at all times. Confidence without specific claims was absolutely the key to longevity in this role. Was it genuinely religious work? Not really, no. Was it entirely political and social? Completely yes. Was it safer than most available Roman professions? Without question. In ancient Rome, belief was power. Religion was power. And the person who quietly controlled access to religious belief and divine favor never had to raise their voice or lift a sword to remain influential and well compensated. You were selling peace of mind, divine insurance, and social respectability. And Rome was more than willing to pay well for all three. After this extensive tour through Rome's strangest yet surprisingly survivable professions, one fundamental truth becomes painfully, obviously clear. The absolute best job in ancient Rome wasn't about prestige or public honor or military heroism. It was about one thing: location. Specifically, whether your job kept you indoors and away from heavy objects, sharp weapons, angry crowds, and harsh weather. That was it. That was the entire key to a long life. Ancient Rome was absolutely not designed for human comfort. It was loud, overcrowded, deeply unsanitary, and violently unpredictable on a daily basis. Most people worked outdoors under the blazing sun, in winter cold, or under someone else's boot and direct control. Farming systematically destroyed your body within years. Construction work crushed you eventually. Military service shortened your life dramatically. And sanitation work tested your will to live on a deep spiritual level. So the real career advice in Rome, the actual wisdom that could save your life, was remarkably simple. If you could sit down while working, you were already winning. You were ahead of 90% of the population. Indoor jobs meant shade during brutal summer heat. They meant warmth during harsh winter cold. And they meant at least a fighting chance of actually seeing old age instead of dying young from injury or disease. They also meant something equally important: proximity to power. And proximity to power was the single most reliable survival strategy in the entire empire. The closer you worked to wealthy households, government officials, or important institutions, the more protected you automatically became. Not necessarily respected by those people, but protected. And in Rome, protection mattered far more than dignity or social status. Every single job we've covered in detail shares one common theme: discretion, silence, knowing when to speak and when to shut up. You didn't speak unless specifically asked. You didn't stand out or draw attention. You didn't moralize about what you saw or heard. You provided a useful service that people wanted, and then you quietly removed yourself from their attention and memory. Rome rewarded usefulness consistently. Rome did not reward bravery or moral stands. The people who lived the longest weren't the strongest, or the loudest, or the most righteous. They were the ones who carefully avoided extremes. They stayed politically neutral. They stayed useful and needed. And most importantly, they stayed alive. It's genuinely tempting to imagine ancient Rome as a place of glory and grandeur. Magnificent marble columns, triumphant military parades, heroic deaths remembered in poetry and song. But for the vast majority of actual people living there, survival itself was the real victory, the true achievement. And survival came from choosing work that didn't involve unnecessary risk, public spectacle, or strong ideological positions. If you could read and write, organize things efficiently, observe carefully, manage people or situations, or simply stay calm while absolutely everyone else lost their minds, Rome had a place for you. Maybe not an admirable place by modern ethical standards. Maybe not a prestigious place that would be remembered, but a safe place. A survivable place. And in a society where public entertainment regularly involved watching people die violently, where political disagreements often ended in assassination, where disease and accidents killed constantly, safety was genuinely the highest luxury available to ordinary people. It was more valuable than wealth, more precious than fame. So yes, the best job in ancient Rome was ultimately any job that kept you indoors, kept you unremarkable and unnoticed, and kept you quietly indispensable to people with power. Because in Rome, The greatest achievement wasn't fame that echoed through history. It wasn't military glory. It wasn't political power. The greatest achievement was simply this: waking up tomorrow, and then the day after that, and continuing to wake up for as many years as possible. That was winning in ancient Rome. That was success. Everything else was just details. Now we shift dramatically from ancient Rome to medieval Europe, to a completely different kind of performance and survival. The moment a medieval king died, his queen immediately ceased to be a living partner in power, and became something else entirely. Not merely a widow in the modern sense, but a symbol. A political object. Her grief was no longer her own personal emotion. It belonged to the court, to the church, to the entire kingdom, all watching extremely closely for any signs of weakness, impropriety, or dangerous ambition. Death did not release her from royal duty. It reshaped that duty into something far more restrictive. In many European courts, the queen learned of the king's death while surrounded by witnesses, ladies in waiting, bishops and clergy, senior nobles and advisers. Private sobbing was actively discouraged. Public composure was absolutely required and expected. The first act of mourning began immediately, within hours. The removal of all color from her life. Jewels were taken away from her. Bright fabrics vanished completely. The queen was dressed in dark wool or heavy black silk. These were fabrics chosen not for her comfort, but for public visibility. Everyone in the kingdom needed to see clearly that official grief had begun, that the transition of power was being handled properly. Her personal chambers often became sealed spaces, almost like voluntary prisons. Windows were shuttered to block natural light. Mirrors were covered with dark cloth. In some kingdoms, queens were expected to remain indoors continuously for weeks or even months, completely cut off from normal daily court life and public activities. Meals were taken in absolute silence. Music stopped entirely. Laughter, even accidental or involuntary, could become genuine scandal and provoke criticism. Mourning was meant to be total, immersive, all-consuming, and completely unmistakable to everyone observing. Yet, this isolation was very carefully staged and controlled. The queen was hidden from public view, but definitely not forgotten by anyone. Messengers regularly reported on her behavior to court officials. Courtiers whispered constantly about how often she prayed, how thin and haggard she looked, how rarely she appeared publicly. Excessive sorrow could be praised as devotion and proper feeling. Too little visible grief could be interpreted as relief at her husband's death, which was politically dangerous. Public rituals of mourning followed extremely strict choreography, like a theatrical performance. When the queen finally emerged for funeral processions and ceremonies, she moved slowly and carefully, eyes lowered, veiled in black fabric so heavy it obscured her face almost completely. She was expected to cry, but not uncontrollably. To kneel, but not collapse entirely. Even her tears had rules and expectations. Widowhood also came with immediate, serious political danger. A grieving queen could still be remarkably powerful, especially if her son was young and needed a regent. This possibility made her mourning deeply suspicious to rival factions. Every gesture was interpreted politically. Every word was analyzed. Was her sorrow genuine, or was she already calculating political alliances, arranging marriages, plotting to control the regency? In theory, mourning honored love and loyalty to the dead king. In practice, it was surveillance. A queen in mourning was actually watched more closely, more suspiciously than a queen actively participating in court life. Her grief had to reassure the entire realm that nothing fundamental had changed, even though absolutely everything had changed. In medieval courts throughout Europe, mourning was communicated through fabric and clothing before it was ever spoken through words. Clothing became a public declaration of grief, and for queens, it followed an absolutely unbending code with no flexibility. Black was not simply a color choice. It was a political and social signal of withdrawal, humility, and ritual obedience to tradition. To wear it incorrectly or abandon it too briefly was to invite immediate suspicion and criticism. The queen's mourning wardrobe was assembled with meticulous care. Heavy black wool for daily wear and private moments. Thick silk for ceremonial public appearances. No embroidery allowed. No shine or luster in the fabric. No metallic thread or decoration. Even buttons and fastenings were deliberately muted or completely hidden from view. The goal was not elegance or beauty. It was erasure. The queen was expected to fade visually from court life, to become a shadow of her former vibrant presence. Veils were absolutely essential and non-negotiable. A widowed queen's veil often covered her hair completely, her neck, and sometimes most of her face depending on the occasion. Hair, which was associated with vitality, sexuality, and fertility, had to be entirely concealed from view. In some particularly strict courts, queens were actually required to cut their hair short or keep it bound tightly beneath layers of cloth. This wasn't just symbolic modesty. It was a deliberate stripping of attractiveness and femininity. A mourning queen was explicitly not meant to inspire any form of desire. Jewelry disappeared entirely from her person. Crowns were set aside and locked away. Rings were removed, sometimes ceremonially broken in public or secured in locked boxes. Even signet rings could be restricted, which directly limited the queen's ability to issue official orders or seal important documents. Mourning had real teeth. It curtailed actual power, as much as it displayed sorrow. The required length of this visual mourning mattered enormously. Queens were expected to wear black for months at minimum, often years. In some kingdoms, lifelong black clothing was encouraged or demanded, especially if remarriage was politically inconvenient for the kingdom. A queen who returned to wearing colors too quickly risked serious accusations of disrespect toward the dead king. Or worse, accusations of eagerness to move on to another marriage or another life. But there was also genuine danger in overperforming grief. Excessively ragged clothing or extreme self-denial could be read as instability or madness. The queen had to look appropriately sorrowful, but still controlled. Devastated but dignified. The balance was incredibly narrow, and failure was remembered and criticized for years. These mourning garments were heavy, uncomfortable, and highly impractical for daily life. Thick layers trapped heat during summer months and provided inadequate insulation during winter cold. Yet, this discomfort was actually part of the ritual itself. Mourning was supposed to weigh physically on the body. Grief had to be visible not only in appearance, but in posture and movement. In this way, clothing became a constant reminder every single moment. Every step, every breath reinforced the loss. The queen did not simply mourn her husband. She wore mourning, lived completely inside it, and allowed it to define her entire place in the world. And still, the cloth hid more than it revealed about her actual thoughts and feelings. After the funeral rites finally ended, the queen's mourning entered its most severe and restrictive phase: isolation. In many medieval courts throughout Europe, a widowed queen was expected to withdraw physically from the world, retreating into a carefully controlled domestic exile that could last months or years. This was not grief as comfort or healing. This was grief as containment and control. Entire sections of palaces were closed off specifically for her confinement. Doors were locked from the outside. Heavy curtains were drawn. Servants were reduced to an absolute minimum. In some extreme cases, queens were confined to a single suite of rooms, leaving only for prayer in private chapels or strictly supervised public appearances. The stated official reason was contemplation and religious devotion. The unspoken real reason was political control. This isolation served several important purposes for the court and kingdom. First, it prevented any possibility of scandal. A grieving queen seen too often in public spaces risked generating gossip and rumor. A queen seen speaking privately with the wrong people risked far worse accusations. By physically removing her from normal circulation, the court dramatically reduced opportunities for rumor, romantic flirtation, or political maneuvering during a vulnerable transition of power. Second, isolation demonstrated complete obedience to tradition. Willing withdrawal showed submission to custom and church expectations. A queen who embraced solitude appeared humble, pious, and appropriately broken by her loss. Any resistance, even subtle or indirect, could be interpreted as pride or ambition. Daily life inside these locked rooms followed ritual monotony. Hours were marked by prayer and religious observation. Meals were deliberately plain and simple. Conversation was minimal to non-existent. Silence was not merely encouraged. It was actively cultivated as a virtue. Music, if permitted at all, was strictly religious and subdued. Laughter was absolutely forbidden. Joy was inherently suspect. Yet isolation did not actually mean invisibility or being forgotten. The queen was constantly observed and reported on. Confessors reported regularly on her spiritual state to church authorities. Ladies-in-waiting noted her behavior in detail. Physicians commented officially on her appetite, sleep patterns, and tears. The court wanted constant reassurance that grief was progressing at the correct pace, neither too fast nor too slow. This confinement could last weeks or months, sometimes considerably longer. For queens who had ruled as regents or held significant political authority before their husband's death, isolation was often partial and strategically adjusted. They might conduct essential affairs of state from behind curtains or screens, unseen but technically present. Grief in these cases became a performance layered over continued exercise of power. For others, isolation marked the beginning of permanent withdrawal from public life. Some queens never fully returned to normal court activities. They aged in shadow, their public identities frozen permanently at the moment of their husband's death. Locked rooms were supposedly meant to quiet the soul and allow peaceful grieving. In reality, they amplified fear, grief, and uncertainty. Alone with memory and social expectation, the queen mourned not only her dead husband but the life she was no longer allowed to live. And the entire kingdom waited outside the door. When a mourning queen was finally seen publicly again, her appearance was never spontaneous or natural. Public grief was staged with exactly the same meticulous care as a coronation ceremony. Every movement, every pause, every tear belonged to a ritual older than the woman performing it. Funeral processions were the first and most critical public display. The queen walked slowly, often supported physically on either side, as if weakened by overwhelming sorrow. Her head remained bowed. Her eyes were cast downward, rarely if ever meeting the crowd's gaze. A heavy veil concealed her face, but not completely. People needed to see just enough to believe the grief was real. Tears were expected and required. Silence was expected. But complete collapse was absolutely not acceptable. A queen who sobbed uncontrollably in public risked appearing unstable or mad. One who showed no visible emotion risked appearing cold or secretly relieved. The correct grief was carefully measured, dignified, and repeatable for future occasions. Courtiers remembered and discussed these performances for years afterward. Public mourning extended far beyond the initial funeral. Anniversaries of the death, religious feast days, memorial masses all required renewed displays of appropriate sorrow. Each appearance reaffirmed loyalty to the deceased king and continuity for the realm. Grief became cyclical, summoned repeatedly on command. Even small gestures carried enormous meaning. Kneeling too long could be read as theatrical overacting. Rising too quickly could be read as impatience to finish. A queen's hands were expected to remain still, folded or clasped. Nervous movement was scrutinized and criticized. Every deviation from the expected script invited interpretation and gossip. Crowds mattered enormously in these performances. Mourning before common people served a different purpose than mourning before nobles. For the general public, the queen embodied shared loss. Her visible sorrow reassured them that the king's death was not merely political but genuinely human. For the nobility, her grief signaled stability and submission to tradition. This performance extended even to speech. When queens spoke during mourning periods, their words were limited and formal. References to divine will were common. Expressions of personal pain were carefully restrained. Love for the dead king was implied, never described in detail. Too much emotion could seem manipulative or theatrical. The irony was genuinely cruel. These public moments often marked the queen's only contact with the outside world after months of complete isolation. Yet even then, she was not free. She was a figure in a ritual, repeating gestures learned from those who came before her, performing for an audience that judged every detail. Public grief was never about personal healing. It was about political reassurance. It told the kingdom that order remained intact, that loss had been absorbed, and that power had not fractured. The queen wept so the entire realm could move on. Grief did not suspend politics in medieval courts. It actually sharpened it. A mourning queen stood at the most dangerous intersection of sympathy and suspicion, and every political faction at court understood this dynamic perfectly. Her sorrow could protect her from criticism. It could also be weaponized against her. Widowhood created immediate political uncertainty. If the queen had a son, especially a young one, she might become regent and wield real power. This possibility made her mourning deeply political. Excessive displays of grief reassured rivals that she was not plotting or scheming. Calm efficiency suggested competence, but risked appearing cold. Either interpretation could be weaponized by enemies. Courtiers watched carefully for telling signs. Who visited her chambers privately? Who carried her messages? Who spoke for her when she remained silent? Mourning restricted physical movement, but not political influence. Letters passed quietly. Confessors doubled as informants. Ladies-in-waiting served as eyes and ears. Some queens used mourning deliberately as a political strategy. Extended withdrawal could frustrate rivals by denying them access to her. Silence could create mystique. A queen unseen, but constantly spoken of retained power precisely because she was absent. Her grief became a shield behind which important decisions were made secretly. Others were trapped by mourning. Advisors might insist she remain secluded longer than custom required, effectively sidelining her politically. Appeals to propriety masked political containment. A queen who resisted could be accused of disrespecting her dead husband's memory. Remarriage complicated absolutely everything. In theory, a queen might remarry for political alliance or personal protection. In practice, too much eagerness damaged her reputation irreparably. A second marriage suggested that the first had not been deeply mourned. Waiting too long risked losing political relevance entirely. Timing was critical and rarely under her actual control. The church played a quiet but powerful role. Confessors advised patience, humility, and acceptance. These virtues aligned perfectly with political stability. Religious language softened hard power decisions. Mourning became a moral framework used to justify exclusion or delay. Even foreign courts paid close attention. Ambassadors reported home on how long the queen wore black, how often she appeared publicly, whether she spoke of the king with proper reverence. Grief became intelligence. In this atmosphere, sorrow was never neutral or purely emotional. It could legitimize authority or undermine it. A grieving queen was pitied, respected, feared, and constrained all at once. Power did not disappear during mourning. It learned to speak softly through ritual, absence, and carefully controlled sorrow. For many medieval queens, mourning was not a season or a phase. It was a permanent destination. While kings remarried quickly and widowers were actively encouraged to restore dynastic stability, queens were often expected to remain in widowhood indefinitely. In theory, this devotion honored the dead. In practice, it simplified politics enormously. A permanently widowed queen posed fewer complications. She produced no rival heirs. She formed no new alliances through marriage. Her loyalty remained fixed to a dynasty that no longer needed her ambition. Lifelong mourning transformed a queen from a political variable into a controlled relic of the past. This expectation was reinforced through custom rather than explicit law. Advisors spoke of dignity. Clerics praised chastity and restraint. Courtiers whispered about impropriety at the suggestion of remarriage. The pressure was subtle but absolutely relentless. A queen who chose to remain in black was praised as virtuous. One who wished to re-enter life risked scandal. Permanent mourning reshaped daily existence completely. Black clothing became habitual. Public appearances grew rarer. The queen's household shrank. Younger attendants were replaced by older, quieter women. Liveliness gave way to routine. Over time, the queen's identity fused entirely with loss. Some queens retreated into religious life. They founded convents, sponsored monasteries, or adopted near-monastic routines within palaces. Prayer replaced politics. Charity replaced ceremony. This withdrawal was often celebrated as holiness, though it conveniently removed influential women from court. Others remained visible but diminished. They attended coronations, weddings, and councils as symbolic figures rather than active participants. Their presence lent continuity, a living memory of the previous reign. They reminded everyone where power had been, not where it was going. The psychological toll was immense. Youth ended abruptly. Desire was erased by expectation. Loneliness was sanctified. A queen could live decades after her husband's death, defined entirely by an event she could never escape. Yet permanence brought a strange authority. A long-widowed queen was untouchable. Her suffering granted moral weight, criticizing her risked appearing cruel. In silence and shadow, she accumulated a different kind of power. Mourning meant to fade became a second crown, heavy, invisible, and impossible to remove. When a medieval queen finally died, the rituals that had governed her life in mourning now turned toward her body. Death did not erase ceremony. It intensified it. Her funeral became a final performance shaped by the same expectations that had defined her grief. Preparation began immediately. The queen's body was washed, anointed, and dressed with deliberate symbolism. If she had lived in mourning, black garments were often replaced with rich ceremonial robes for burial, signaling transition rather than sorrow. Crowns once set aside might return in death, restoring the dignity suspended in widowhood. The body lay in state, sometimes for days. Candles burned continuously. Clergy chanted prayers for the soul. Nobles filed past in silence. This display reaffirmed hierarchy even in death. Who stood closest? Who knelt longest? Who touched the bier? All carried meaning. Funeral processions echoed royal funerals, but with emphasis on piety rather than power. Effigies were sometimes used, especially when the body could not be publicly displayed. These lifelike figures wore regalia, allowing the queen to appear one final time before her people. Mourning extended outward. The court wore black again. Bells tolled across cities. Masses were ordered. Public grief was expected even from those who had never seen the queen alive. Her death became communal property. Burial sites were chosen carefully. Queens were often interred near their husbands, reinforcing dynastic unity beyond death. Tombs depicted idealized images. Serene faces, hands folded in prayer, eternal calm. The years of constraint and isolation disappeared beneath carved stone. Inscriptions emphasized virtue, loyalty, fertility, and devotion. Political conflict was erased. Personal suffering was smoothed into piety. The queen's life was rewritten in marble. Ironically, death offered a freedom denied in life. The dead queen could wear jewels again. She could be publicly honored without suspicion. She could be remembered selectively. The rituals surrounding her funeral closed a long circle. The queen, who had performed grief so carefully, was now the subject of it. Others wore black. Others wept in measured silence. Her sorrow ended. The ritual remained. After burial, a queen's mourning did not truly end. It changed form. Her grief, once embodied, became remembered, retold, and reshaped by those who survived her. Memory was selective, and it rarely favored complexity. Chroniclers framed queens according to how well they had performed sorrow. A woman who mourned quietly and long was praised as faithful and virtuous. One who returned to politics or remarried was described as ambitious, cold, or unnatural. Grief became a moral measuring stick applied after death. Art played a powerful role. Illuminated manuscripts depicted widowed queens kneeling in prayer, veiled and subdued. Tapestries showed them beside their husbands, frozen in ideal harmony. Even queens known for sharp political maneuvering were softened in visual memory. Mourning erased edges. Religious foundations ensured remembrance. Queens who endowed monasteries or chapels in memory of their husbands tied their grief to sacred space. Monks prayed for both souls together, reinforcing eternal unity. The queen's sorrow was transformed into perpetual devotion. Anniversaries mattered. Death dates were marked by masses, offerings, and alms. Each ritual renewed the story. Over time, personal grief dissolved into institutional habit. What had once been intimate became routine. Legends grew. Some queens were remembered for tears that never ceased, others for noble restraint. Rarely were they remembered for anger, resentment, or relief. Those emotions did not fit the script. This posthumous shaping served political ends. Dynasties preferred obedient widows in memory. The past was curated to teach future queens how to behave. Mourning became instruction. Yet beneath myth, traces of reality survived. Letters hinted at loneliness. Accounts noted confinement. Marginal notes recorded resistance. These fragments remind us that behind the rituals stood a woman navigating loss under watchful eyes. The queen's grief did not die with her. It became an example, a warning, and a lesson preserved long after the black cloth had faded. By the end of a medieval queen's mourning journey, grief was no longer a response to death. It had become a role so deeply ingrained that separating the woman from the ritual was nearly impossible. What began as loss hardened into expectation. Sorrow was not something she experienced. It was something she embodied permanently. From the moment of widowhood onward, the queen's identity was rewritten. She was no longer defined by marriage, fertility, or shared rule, but by restraint. Her value lay in how convincingly she demonstrated loyalty to a past that could not be revived. Mourning became proof of legitimacy, not emotion. This expectation followed queens across decades. Even when political circumstances changed, when sons came of age or dynasties stabilized, the shadow of grief remained. A queen who had once mourned publicly was expected to carry that posture forever. Joy became inappropriate. Desire became suspicious. Independence became threatening. The tragedy was not that grief was demanded, but that it was never allowed to evolve. Modern mourning assumes a movement through sorrow. Medieval queens were denied that progression. Healing risked misinterpretation. Moving forward suggested disloyalty. Remaining still was safer. In this way, mourning shaped personality. Some queens internalized silence, becoming cautious and reserved even in private. Others learned to wear grief like armor, using humility to deflect scrutiny while exercising influence quietly. A few resisted, pushing against expectation and paying the price in reputation. What we see in records is often the performance, not the person. Chroniclers praised obedience and piety, mistaking survival for virtue. The inner lives of these women remain mostly hidden, buried beneath ceremony and moral judgment. Yet across kingdoms and centuries, the pattern repeats with striking consistency. Black cloth, locked rooms, measured tears, long years of waiting. This was not coincidence. It was structure. Mourning was one of the few spaces where queens were allowed to exist visibly without threatening male authority. But that visibility came at a cost. It demanded a ratio of joy, agency, and personal renewal. In the end, medieval queens did not simply mourn death. They lived inside it. Their sorrow was curated, enforced, and remembered more clearly than their ambitions or intellect. Power could be taken away. Titles could be removed. But grief, once assigned, was permanent. And that was the final ritual. And that brings us to the end of this exploration. From the strange survival jobs of ancient Rome to the controlled grief of medieval queens, we've seen how people navigated systems designed to constrain them. If you made it this far, thank you. Hit subscribe if you want more content like this. And let me know in the comments what surprised you most. I'll see you in the next one.